The files also include a diary from a woman who says she gave birth to Epstein's child around 2002.
If you want to become a real massage therapist, we can get you trained, you can come for the interview tonight, and if he likes you, then you'll be a real masseuse. And you'll get to see the world, and you'll get paid $200 per massage. And
these messages from 2013 show Epstein connecting New York Giants co-owner Steve Tisch with various women. In one exchange, Tisch asked about a woman only identified as M, writing, "Curious to know about M, pro or civilian?"
She led me up a staircase, and we made a right into Jeffrey's room, and Jeffrey laying naked on the massage table. Jeffrey lifts his head up, looks at Ghislaine. Ghislaine looks at him, and I call it the Cheshire cat grin because his face just went like this, and it was like a nod of approval.
About accountability.
Do you think you're the devil himself?
No, but I do have a good mirror.
That's the worst thing that I could have done, because I just let them know that I'm vulnerable and I'm their perfect type.
Pretty recently, the FBI released like a ton of files connected to the Epstein case. In this video, we're going to take a look at all these documents and try to figure out what they actually mean and, what's changed in the world since they dropped this stuff. Back in 2005, a worried family reached out to the police. They reported that their 14-year-old daughter was being seen a lot with this rich-looking older guy. The police started investigating this report and pretty quickly found out that at one of the Miami schools, students were talking about how there's a way to make quick money if you go give massages to wealthy dudes. Several girls said that some rich guy who introduced himself as Jeff, actually Epstein was offering them anywhere from $200 to $500 per massage session. For some of the older ones, he was offering to pay more for extra options. And for those who wouldn't agree to the options, he'd offer them money to find other girls who would agree. Some of them took him up on it. All of this was happening in these luxurious mansions, where besides Epstein, they'd see some strict-looking woman and occasionally other people. At that point, the police case quickly accumulated several dozen victims who were telling pretty much the same story. They were offered money to work with a wealthy client at one of the mansions, and this whole thing really blew up because not all of these girls were old enough. The one who was 14 told them she went to give massages about 100 times, and when she turned 16, Epstein started taking photos of her, paying $500 per photo shoot. This led investigators to believe he was keeping these photographs, which is super illegal, so a criminal case was opened. The police started by going through the trash near the mansions, and immediately found piles of adult toys. On top of that, different girls were constantly coming to these mansions. The picture was becoming clear. The case itself became really high profile, and new victims were coming forward probably every single day. Miami police were registering one new victim after another, all with basically the same story about massages for $200 at a luxury mansion. Here's something weird. One woman reported that Epstein stole photographs of her underage sisters that she'd taken for painting practice. So this billionaire apparently broke into this artist's home and stole the photographs. Sounds convincing, right? Anyway, Jeffrey was actively collecting photos like these, which was already a serious charge against him. And the police also found out during the investigation that Epstein was ordering adult tapes and books on an industrial scale. The guy was quite a character, to put it mildly. Overall, the case looked like this super wealthy dude was inviting underage girls to his mansion, and there they'd have these massage sessions. What happened after that varied, but judging from the case materials, when a girl didn't like something, Epstein would apologize and even pay more. It later turned out that he had over 50 guests in total. Soon a search was conducted at one of the mansions. Police found several hidden cameras, and, of course, what the detectives came for, a massive pile of photographs of the visitors to this place. More than enough for some really serious charges. However, Epstein, thanks to the work of literally a whole team of outstanding lawyers, got a very light sentence. In 2011, the verdict was announced. 19 months in a comfortable prison, and after 3 months, he got the right to work-release trips, because, you know, he was still this renowned financier, and his lawyers were getting their fees. On top of that, he agreed to pay relatively small compensations to 40 of the victims. This absolutely shocked and enraged American society. Obviously, like, an ordinary person with that kind of charge sheet would have been locked up for life, and they would have gotten this kind of sentence for a drunken bar fight. But when you're talking about someone with money and connections, everything works differently. Investigating the events at the financiers' mansions became kind of a national sport for Americans, and even though Epstein himself, thanks to his effective defense, seemed to be getting off scotangent-free, more and more details were emerging. According to these details, this whole story was way more complicated, and it wasn't just about some rich pervert bringing girls of questionable age to his mansion. In Europe, this case made headlines for a somewhat different reason. It turned out that Epstein had developed connections with a large number of British aristocrats, and even with the royal family. At some point, various lords and even princes lined up to declare they had no idea what a terrible person they were dealing with. Some of them managed to distance themselves, others became real outcasts. Prince Andrew, for example, basically stopped being a prince altogether. But here's the thing. He only lost his title in 2025, which means it took almost 20 years of continuous public pressure. The scandal reached a pan-European scale. Anyway, from 2011 to 2019, everything was quiet, except for conspiracy theories that were actively circulating. Conspiracy theorists got all worked up around 2016, when correspondence from American political strategist John Podesta appeared on the well-known leak site WikiLeaks. At first glance, it was just some regular political stuff, but an anonymous user on 4chan noticed that certain phrases and words related to pizza kept repeating in the correspondence. So either John Podesta is like a huge pizza fan, or the word pizza has some other meaning here. Of course, the anonymous user immediately figured out that pizza meant underage slaves being sold to the elite. This insight, so to speak, became known as Pizzagate. In the conspiracy community, a theory started forming that the world elite was trafficking children, and at the center of it all was, of course, the somewhat forgotten by that point Epstein. This theory got more fuel when news broke that during searches of Epstein's mansions, they found tons of paintings depicting not exactly adult people in pretty ambiguous situations. Why the distinguished guests of the famous financier enjoyed looking at such paintings is, an interesting question in itself. A bit later, starting around 2017, another conspiracy scandal erupted called QAnon. On 4chan, in the /poll section, the same place where politicized edgelords from all over the world trash-talk each other, an anonymous user appeared who signed off simply with the letter Q. This Q claimed he was a Trump administration employee and was ready to anonymously share with the public information about an existing global conspiracy of PDF file enthusiasts and Satanists. He also made several prophecies, like that Trump would soon conduct mass arrests of those involved in the conspiracy, and also said that Kennedy's son would return to big politics. The prophecies somehow didn't come true, but this psyop successfully cemented the idea that Trump would come and everything hidden would be revealed. Trump himself actively picked up this wave, if he didn't start it in the first place, and built a substantial part of his campaign promises on the fact that once in power, he'd publish the whole truth, including all the documents the FBI had on Epstein. Especially since there seemed to be plenty to publish even back then, rumors were going around that after 2011, Epstein not only didn't quit his massage business, but was involving literally the entire world elite in it. After Trump's victory in the presidential race, all documents turned into some documents, which is probably logical since most of the case documents are just regular legal paperwork, and some reveal the identities of victims. But people immediately suspected something fishy, and started saying that Trump himself had been a guest at the successful financier's mansions. In 2019, Epstein ended up in a prison cell again. The FBI, after a series of searches, was able to bring charges against him for human trafficking. It seemed like a serious case, but on the other hand, the evidence this time couldn't even be called particularly convincing, and there was this feeling that now a whole army of lawyers would show up again and everything would end like it always does. But suddenly, Epstein was placed in a regular prison for regular criminals, and in a cell with a guy who was accused of multiple murders and ties to the drug mafia, a real cartel enforcer. And a little while later, America's main defendant was found in a noose. It's funny that in 2020, a lawyer for some inmate named Richard Taus reported that his client was in the same prison where Epstein was, and he knew what actually happened. But nothing more was heard about it. What happened in Epstein's cell stayed in Epstein's cell. The official version says he ended it himself, but you don't even need to be a conspiracy theorist to put the facts together and draw some conclusions. From 2011 to 2019, Epstein was doing something very interesting. But as for the official charges, how well founded was the FBI's position? We're not going to dive into these legal weeds, but here's where an interesting twist happens. Charges similar to Epstein's were brought in 2020 against Ghislaine Maxwell, a woman of undefined occupation who everyone calls a socialite. She made her living by spending her days among aristocrats and the wealthy, a person of such a respectable profession. Ghislaine Maxwell turned out to be the only one who got serious time in the Epstein case. She was sentenced to 20 years in 2022. How did that happen? Well, something interesting came to light. This socialite was the exact person who introduced the above-mentioned Prince Andrew to Epstein, and she was the one who, in the late 90s and early 2000s, was initially finding and bringing young girls to the rich guy's mansion. And yeah, besides that, she was hanging around aristocrats and wealthy people. Put these two things together and we're starting to suspect where this is all going. The first document offers us a look at photographs taken by the FBI in 2019 at the New York mansion. I mainly used them as illustrations for the previous part of the video. What's interesting here is maybe that painting of Clinton in a woman's dress, and also a caricature in the bathroom where Clinton is depicted with Epstein. In general, there are quite a few caricatures of different politicians on the walls here, and considering they were probably guests at this house, the atmosphere there must have been, pretty interesting. The house has a lot of paintings and statues here. For example, there's a figure of a woman climbing up a rope. There was a little drama around it, by the way. A lot of people thought it was a hanged mummy, but if you look closely, you can see it's a figure of a woman holding onto a rope with her hands. And the classical paintings here are just normal room decorations. And here's a real shocker Einstein at Epstein's house. The first and second floors look pretty decent. There are several photos of Epstein with young ladies, let's say, and they look more like family photos, but maybe that's what they are. And religious symbols are visible everywhere, which adds to the picture of an exemplary family man. On the desk, though, there are more interesting photographs, although even here you'd have to imagine a lot to see something, questionable. But on the third floor of the mansion, the setting is more interesting. Erotic photos hang on the walls. Here, they look like magazine photographs, with professional models, although why they covered up the model with a square is unclear. Although they're covering up all the most interesting parts in the paintings too, even though most paintings can be Googled. For example, this one can be found without the squares. It was painted by artist Jorge Alvarez, and it's called Coming of Age Ceremony. Although the content of this painting is more than questionable, of course. And I'm also curious, is that a real terracotta warrior? The rooms on the third floor are literally filled with erotic paintings, photos with model-looking girls, and antique-looking statues that appear to be original. Interesting decorating approach. And here's a more grim moment, a dark red room with photographs and paintings of children. There's nothing particularly special in the images themselves, but in the overall context, it looks creepy. You can enter the 4th and higher floors through a door with a sign that says, "Video surveillance 24 hours." It seems like there wasn't such a sign before. On the 4th floor, there are several small rooms in different styles with beds and art objects with erotic themes. Photographs from 254 to 305 are missing. Well, probably there was something unimportant there. Oh right, they're not in the web version because it's basically made poorly. Gonna have to download the archive. And yeah, I downloaded the whole archive, and what do I see? In this part that's missing from the website, there are mostly shots of a gym. Epstein kept himself in shape, but here too, the shower and bathroom have various art objects of an erotic nature. Painted, photographed, and plaster women are everywhere here. It seems like this style, starting from the 3rd floor, is everywhere here. We move to the 5th floor, and it looks like one big living room with sofas and armchairs. Apparently, that's where the distinguished guests would rest after exercising in the gym and on the beds. However, there are also rooms with beds here, and their design is noticeably cheaper than the floor below. And there's also the cleanest kitchen in the whole house, and airplane figurines instead of original ancient statues. Maybe it's the servants' floor. You can feel, so to speak, the class divide. There's also a document storage area here where some of the writing is covered with black squares, although the photo quality is too low to read what's written anyway. We'll come back to the documents from the folders. But for now, let's go to the 6th floor. Epstein's not some broke guy to live in a 5-story mansion. There are mostly technical rooms there, but there's also a couple of rooms with unusual design and a small balcony. We go down to the basement, and what do we see? A kitchen, like in a real restaurant, and something like a small cafe. On the wall, there's a photo from some photo shoot, and again, the girl's face is covered with a square. On the negative 1st floor of the mansion, there are boiler rooms and other technical spaces, but there's something else here too. I didn't quite understand how the person taking photos got there, but there's a passage with a spiral staircase, and the walls here are filled with shelves of books. The stairs end at wooden doors. Behind them is a small room with a single bed and tons of erotic paintings and cabinets filled with documents. Although, is it a regular bed or not? It looks more like something that's used together with, this equipment that's also modestly standing in the corner here. Or maybe it's an old massage table. Could this be where all the so-called massage sessions took place? And in this secret room, a lot of interesting materials are found. Here's a photo album where Epstein is spending time with girls. They really do look like teenagers, although you can't see their faces, so it's hard to say. Among other things, there's a note written by someone named Stephen D. Small. The English-speaking audience on Reddit notes that it's extremely ungrammatical, by the way. But this message isn't from a middle school student jealous of his girlfriend. It's from a major British financier to Epstein, where he expresses sympathy to the addressee because he got into such an unpleasant situation. According to Small's version, the victim in this story is Epstein himself, because the girls who attended his parties knew where and why they were going, and now they won't leave him alone until they squeeze all the money out of him. And, in general, everyone wants to grab something from rich people, Small laments. Those damn poor people. And here, by the way, the FBI photographer got creative with censoring an art object. There are also many other letters here. Here it's noted that Epstein is a deeply religious person and wouldn't allow himself to do anything bad. Although, from a person who keeps a stuffed dog in his house, you can probably expect anything. And of course, there's just a huge number of photos of the video's hero with women of the most varied ages. Seems like Jeffrey himself didn't have specific age preferences. Besides that, there are photos on the walls here that are clearly amateur quality, not from glossy magazine photoshoots, and it looks like they're of girls who were in the mansion. At some point, they found a whole warehouse of such photographs here, so it seems like the operation was running like a conveyor belt. Well, we already know that from the police investigation anyway. In general, quite a few fetish toys were found in the rooms, various costumes, which pretty unambiguously indicates what was happening there. Looks like this was a real brothel for the wealthy. FBI agents also opened a safe, and surprisingly, instead of a pile of money or valuables, they found documents. More on those later. And in general, maybe this whole story would have remained practically unknown. A rich guy bringing young girls to his mansion is a topic for the press to discuss for a couple of days, if not for one circumstance. They found photographs of Epstein in the mansion, probably with every possible celebrity. We're leaving the mansion and moving to the beach episode. So basically, starting in '98, Epstein had his own private island, and conspiracy theories were going around that the worst stuff was happening there. In Epstein's documents, you can find mention of some island project he was working on. On that same island, which is commonly called Epstein's Island, a paradise corner lost in the middle of the ocean, that's what we're going to look at. Hard to believe that such a place could hide any dark secrets. The luxurious villa inside is done in a very light style, everything is very bright, and white colour everywhere. A photograph hangs on the wall here, the content of which is covered with squares, and we can only guess what was even there. The censor left absolutely no chance here. There are statues and figures with a slight erotic hint standing everywhere. There are paintings too, but they don't even come close to the content in the mansion. Although the censors are going crazy here too, crossing out paintings with squares so much that I couldn't find the full version of this one. The bedrooms look just as carefree, white-on-white style, though in some there's evidence of a small mess. From this list, we learn that 40 people serviced all this beauty. By the way, FBI agents also found scans of documents of some of these workers, and they were posted almost without censorship. You can tell right away, ordinary people. Let's look at the main house, and here we're greeted again by ancient statues. Inside, there's a bed and a small work office. Nothing special either. For some reason there's an eye examination device here apparently. One of the guests had poor vision. There's also a dental office. On one of the buildings here, there's something like a Roman mosaic. I don't know about the rest, but in terms of decorations, the local resident preferred older stuff. The building with the mosaic houses a library with antique books. Suddenly, among the books, there's a photo of a man, seemingly in women's clothing. It's even curious why they covered the face with a square. And there's also a photo found here of Epstein with a little girl in a private jet cabin. Among other papers, there's a strict instruction that Epstein is required to report to the state when he's on his island and has to spend some time in prison sometimes, punished with full severity. There's also a notification that he's registered on the sex offender list. And here's a map of the island. And here, even in some comic, they covered faces with squares what kind of people. And here we find something interesting. A stack of papers that even say they're important papers. Mostly various tax and legal documents. On this paper, the text is covered with a square, but that's, judging by everything, to protect attorney-client privilege. There's also a bunch of photos of various women here, but without any hints of sexuality. And here we've reached something interesting. Epstein's personal materials, mostly very old photographs. Apparently, from Jeffrey's own life. And here's a Christmas letter where some woman thanks Jeffrey for expensive holiday gifts. And here, it seems, another woman thanks him for giving her the opportunity to participate in an African safari. And here some woman is kneeling. In general, there are a lot of photographs of women with faces covered by squares. I suspect these are the ones who appear in the case as victims. The age of, like this black square for example, is pretty hard to determine by eye, but among the images there is some way you can tell by the body structure that it's a very young teenager, at best. On the other hand, everyone here is dressed in relatively normal situations. And although someone's without a square, here we have a photograph of Epstein with Ghislaine Maxwell, the same one who got 20 years for human trafficking. I couldn't manage to read her letter, though handwritten English is so messy I just can't read it. Something about birthdays, gifts, meetings with childhood friends. In general, the photographs found on Epstein's Island are more family-like or friendly. It seems like the real den of debauchery was the mansion, not the island. Or they haven't shown us something yet at that point. Nevertheless, it looks suspicious that so many people's faces are covered with squares. Like, for what reason shouldn't we see the face of this brave jet pilot? Looks like some decorated US Air Force fighter, whose uniform is also lying here for some reason. And here's an Israeli army t-shirt, conspiracy theorists. Your turn. And here's more proof. Let's also look at the thing that caused the most explosive reaction among the conspiracy community, namely the strange-looking temple. It's hard to attribute it to any specific religion. By design, it's probably closest to Zoroastrian temples. Well, that's what I could remember. Inside, the temple is unfinished. There's not really much for the eye to latch onto, except you can see a fresco with centaurs on the ceiling. Could it be a cult of Dionysus? For such an island, this deity would definitely be the best fit, since obtaining pleasure by all possible means was the foundation of this religion. Okay, we've looked at Epstein's mansion and his island, and what we saw definitely raises questions about what was actually going on here. And apparently, it's time to turn to other materials to understand the context. The second set of files are photographs taken by some person who travelled with Epstein and photographed everything. Here's the video's hero with Ghislaine Maxwell in some exotic country, and here, somewhere in Europe. And here, two mid-level American politicians are photographed. Both aren't known for anything remarkable, but they appear in photos often. But it would seem like, here we go, politicians hanging out with Epstein. What we were looking for, why am I paying so little attention to this? Well, here's why we've got bigger fish here. The 42nd President of America, a big supporter of centrism and reconciliation of everyone with everyone, better known in the CIS as Friend Bill, actually Bill Clinton. There's so much Clinton in these photos that it feels like the three of them are traveling together, Epstein, Maxwell, and Clinton. Clinton himself was photographed several times in the company of young people, and judging by these photos, he wasn't wasting his time there. From time to time, mid-level politicians join them, about whom there's really not much to say. Besides politicians, there are also artists here. For example, comedian and actor Chris Tucker, and they write that the photo was taken on that same plane where Epstein transported his underage victims. There's also a bunch of various actors and musicians I first learned about when I was searching who's in the photo, but the person in this image is impossible not to recognize. Ladies and gentlemen, meet Michael Jackson, a person who was involved in similar scandals back when Epstein was just building his financial empire. And here we have Mick Jagger showing up old school rock was also respected on the scandalous island. Basically, there are so many A-list stars here that listing second-tier artists, mid-level politicians, and just billionaires doesn't even make sense. They look like extras here. Among the wealthy, though, I'll mention Richard Branson, founder of the private space company Virgin Group. Well, get it? Virgin, like innocence, on Epstein's island. Alright, stupid joke. Although among these extras, there are some pretty strange guests. Here, for example, is theoretical physicist Freeman Dyson, known for many important discoveries. And here Epstein is enthusiastically chatting with the outstanding mathematician Benoit Mandelbrot, although Epstein himself is a mathematician, so the conversation was probably interesting. There are also pretty specific photographs here. For example, Ghislaine in the company of a Colombian military officer. She generally seems to love various military themes. There are lots of photos with equipment here, so she also found entertainment to her liking. She's switching from military helicopters to sports cars and back. Some photos reveal Epstein's connections a bit better. Here, for example, is a frequent guest of his island, Jean-Luc Brunel. He was a friend of Ghislaine Maxwell since the 80s, and through her he met Epstein. Through this acquaintance, Jean-Luc received financing and organized a modeling agency in 2004. The agency itself often found itself at the center of scandals related to the fact that the models in it, let's say, weren't just models. He himself was accused several times of transporting girls to Epstein's island. He himself even sued Epstein at some point, because the scandal with him led to his company suffering significant losses. And after the death of his former patron, he suddenly went on the run for some reason. In 2020, he was caught by police who accused him of involuntary relations with a woman back in 1990. And in 2022, Jean-Luc Brunel was found dead in his prison cell. This person's death so far looks like the strangest part of this whole story. It's even weird that people discuss it so little, although maybe it's because everyone already understands what the modelling business is like anyway. Another small story is told by this photo here. We see Glenn Dubin. Financier Glenn Dubin met Epstein after he started dating his ex, with whom he had 3 children. For these children, Epstein served as godfather, and judging by everything, it's their photos that are standing on the first floors of the New York mansion. At some point, scans of documents found in the mansion and on the island were published. There are, judging by everything, tons of photos of girls, and almost all are covered with squares. There's almost nothing to look at. The same black Epstein squares. Although, sometimes the censor was in a better mood, and you can make something out. The question of censorship in these files is, of course, interesting. On one hand, the black squares are meant to protect the victimized girls, and just uninvolved people from unnecessary attention. Also, the censor clearly tried to cover everything indecent, even in paintings, which, honestly, is already strange. On the other hand, the black squares might be hiding not just victims' faces and 18+ content, but also, for example, the fact that someone important was involved in Epstein's affairs, or generally something the public should know about. It's like the censorship might be covering not just photos of breasts and girls' faces, but could be a political tool, because you can show only that part of the truth that will cause the desired effect. And honestly, the censor could have applied their squares in a way to cover everything and make it clear what's in the photo, but either they got lazy or they hid something from us. There's something interesting here, the diary of one of the recruited girls. She describes how at the age of 16 she ran away from home and lived with her sister on random earnings until they met Epstein. He invited the girls to his mansion, where he immediately suggested they give him a massage. Of course, things quickly went further, and now the 2 sisters were flying all over the world on Epstein's private jet, and eventually, by the time they turned 18, they settled on the island. She writes that she saw tons of other girls, all of whom serviced the island's guests. Whether any of them were under 18, she doesn't know. Interestingly, when describing the island's residents, she speaks worst about Ghislaine Maxwell, describing her as menacing and cold. The girls on the island feared her specifically. She also saw Jean-Luc often, but doesn't write anything bad about him. She speaks well of Epstein. He helped the girls with little things, drove them to various places, and gave gifts. Well, and his views on relationships were interesting. Of course, the guy believed in collecting a harem, so it seems like he was collecting one, picking up poor girls and luring them first to his mansion, then to the island. Although there's one unusual episode here, judging by everything. Those same sisters were tied to a tree, but I'm not going to show that here. The black squares here leave a heavy impression because from the materials shown, you can probably only conclude that Epstein was at most a pimp for the wealthy, but he's accused of much more serious things. After all, Ghislaine Maxwell got 20 years for what was happening on the island, and she, by the way, was tried by a jury, basically ordinary people who saw all these files without the squares, and they tend to be more sympathetic toward the accused. Anyway, we've looked at the evidence in the case, now we'll study the main thing, the documents. From the first document from 2011, about assigning 2 agents to investigate the Epstein case, we learned that initially there were 4 suspects: Epstein, Maxwell, and 2 others we don't know about. From the next document, you can learn that Epstein was suspected of recruiting young women from a Miami high school to work as masseuses and for services of a more adult nature, paying them from $200 to $1,000 per session. With some of them, he later traveled around the world on a private jet and allowed them to live in his mansion. For this, they had to meet with many men. The main question is, of course, whether all participants in this story were old enough. So far, only a 14-year-old witness is mentioned in the case, who saw her older friend meeting with Epstein, as you can see. Officers with level 5 clearance were definitely able to assess the full horror of the situation these girls found themselves in. Here, the censor tried especially hard. The FBI case from 2011, where they were apparently working with 10 victims, was declassified in such a way that besides the plot of the case, it's impossible to learn anything else. Solid black squares instead of pages. Here's only the police investigation in more or less decent form. That's basically what I'm reading in this video at the very beginning. There's also a whole pile of various Epstein notes, and this one caught my attention. Jean-Luc, Jeffrey's partner, apparently suffered from some disease that could make him impotent, which is ironic considering what they were doing. But overall, the documents in the Epstein case are really kind of a disappointment. Like, 80% of the materials are covered with black squares, and even I, a person who's usually skeptical about everything, I'm starting to suspect that there's way more to this case than what's already known from the initial police investigation. There's something here that the powerful of this world are trying their hardest to hide. Although this is still better than countries that don't report to their population at all, so everything's relative, you know. Responding to people's dissatisfaction, the FBI teased the next season of this series, showing entire boxes of documents and stacks of hard drives, the disclosure of information from which will now definitely show us the whole truth. The next batch of documents begins with a transcript of a court hearing in 2018. The first to speak is a special secret agent, and they ask him tons of questions. From the answers, we learn that Epstein had 4 mansions, and that the same schoolgirl from whom everything started in 2005 was a troubled teenager. We learn that due to her difficult character, she dropped out of school, and because of family problems, she left home. When she was working as a waitress, some woman offered her easy money giving massages to wealthy dudes. After agreeing to this, she ended up in interiors she later described as being from the fairy tale Beauty and the Beast. It's noted that she was afraid to testify because she believed they were accusing her too, since she not only went to Epstein herself, but also actively searched for new girls for his mansions. She recruited her friends and her friends' friends, and also looked for girls in clubs and other social hangouts. She alone brought 20 to 50 girls, meaning from half to practically all the guests of Epstein's mansion, and got $300 for each one. At the same time, her friend is described further, whose role isn't entirely clear. Maybe she brought the other half of the girls. The girls' fears were, by the way, not entirely unfounded. Later in the case, the probability that some of the victims themselves would end up in prison was not zero. This is, of course, shocking information, but what's more interesting is how Epstein connected with world politicians and celebrities with this enterprise of his. Overall, the picture emerges that Epstein and Maxwell were engaged in similar activities for 11 years from 1994 to 2005, before anyone even found out about it. And during this period, dozens of girls had already passed through his mansions before the well-known scandal. Epstein and Maxwell weren't just doing this, they created a pretty well-thought-out scheme for involving girls in such things. It's even surprising that for almost 15 years total, they were essentially doing this just for their own entertainment. It's for this activity that Maxwell received 20 years in prison. In New York, by the way, the age of consent is 17, not 16 like in most states, so even if it's true that some actions were only with those who were already 16, it's still a PDF file, according to New York state law. I think that's enough of an introduction, let's dive into the documents. And it's pretty painful to read. I got to page 50. And the person asking questions hasn't asked a single normal question, the person answering hasn't given a single adequate response, and they're constantly interrupting each other with tons of filler words. The dialogues are worthy of Green Elephant or something like that. At some point, the person conducting the interview asks if everything's generally okay with their conversation partner. With such a prosecutor, you probably really just need a good lawyer to guarantee not going to prison, although maybe the sly guy is deliberately creating that impression. Only on page 99 of this dialogue does he say something relevant, namely that he made a deal with Epstein's lawyers because he believed that some of the victims didn't think anything bad happened to them, and the other part could be easily intimidated, and the prosecution might not win the case in the end, which would be a total disaster, so they decided to punish him somehow. The person conducting the interview makes a fair observation that the girls aren't some biomass with a collective mind. At least one could support the prosecution. To this, Renee says, they all communicate with each other and one won't go against everyone, and some of them even openly sided with Epstein, plus, he has great lawyers and I've got nothing. Which is strange, by the way, because at least in the 2019 case, there were girls who insisted they were victims of a crime. Besides, this totally shady story happened. Then 3 girls decided to speak out against Epstein and turned to the firm of lawyer and financier Rothstein for this. The problem was that Rothstein was organizing a financial pyramid scheme at the time, which is what he got caught for. For Epstein's lawyers, this was a real gift. There was also a case where a state investigator told the parents of one of the victims that videos with their daughter would end up on the internet if they didn't drop the case. That's -1 more, but supposedly there were still 7 left, which is still a lot. And here we have to acknowledge the simply excellent, titanic legal work of lawyer Goldberger. Reading the court documents, you understand that only thanks to this person was such a light punishment for Epstein even possible. Otherwise, the documents from these boxes are either procedural documents or endless rehashing of events from 94 to 2005 without any new information. Although it becomes clearer why there are so many black squares requests to classify one part of the case or another came from all participants, meaning both from the accused and from the victims. Interesting details, of course, but there's still no answer to the questions about how and when these gatherings started being attended by billionaires, politicians, and celebrities, and also what was happening from 2011 to 2019. So, the final package of documents. Huge in size, by the way. In the 8th package, more was published than in all the previous ones combined, and most importantly, these are documents relating to events after the initial investigation. The bulk of the volume here consists of video recordings from surveillance cameras in the prison where Epstein died. At first, it seems like the information value of these recordings is 0. Nothing happens in any of them. But studying the documents, you can understand that on the day of Epstein's death, the prison guards simply blew off their duties to check on inmates, which is visible in the recordings. Whether they always work like that, or whether there's something more behind it, that's an interesting question. After Epstein's death, several inspections were conducted at the prison, and they found tons of violations. Guards were falsifying documents, specifically entering data about checking on inmates without actually checking, bringing in contraband, basically doing anything but work. There were very few of these guards themselves. The prison was experiencing a severe staff shortage, basically. Nobody wanted to work there. Also, on Epstein's last day, his cellmate wasn't there. He was taken somewhere that day. On the fatal night, he was alone in the cell. Probably alone, since the video camera pointed at his prison cell was broken that day. It's even weird because this is a prison for pretty dangerous guys. Epstein's cellmate had killed a bunch of people. There's also quite a bit of various correspondence here regarding the death of the wealthy inmate, among which, by the way, there's a whole group of files with the label "Image Not Created," a suspicious technical error. In some places, there are tons of these 10 declassifications out of 10. Attention to the episode of Epstein's death is, of course, huge, but after reading about 15,000 documents in the case at the time of writing these lines, I got the impression that if he was killed, it was more likely for financial matters, because shortly before his death, he was managing huge flows of grey money, and it seems was somehow close to ratting out his accomplices, specifically in this area. A couple of papers in the 8th document package are also devoted to this. Back in 2008, news appeared that Epstein intended to flee because he was actively transferring money to unknown offshore accounts. There are documents discussing Epstein's connections with financier Leon Black, with whom they were pulling all kinds of schemes. And from another letter it becomes clear that Epstein, together with this Black, organized an entire network of charitable foundations through which he may have been laundering large amounts of money. Something very strange was also happening in England. Here from the documents, you can see that Prince Andrew, the one who stopped being a prince because of this whole scandal, was actively corresponding with Maxwell, and she was selecting new unsuitable friends for him, as he called it, in the correspondence, apparently, from among the mansion's guests. But there's something else. When this whole scandal blew up, British police received several anonymous letters with stories that in the mid-90s, Prince Andrew and accomplices were kidnapping minors and doing really terrible things to them. These are still anonymous letters, not some investigation, and honestly, they're written like some fan fiction, but worth checking out anyway. Besides, judging by the correspondence, Prince Andrew wasn't very favourably disposed toward the FBI investigation, and there's probably some reason for that. And what business Epstein was conducting in England remained unclear from the investigation materials, which leaves wide room for theories and speculation. But what's happening, you might ask? Earlier, there seemed to be some narrative, logic, and now I'm jumping from topic to topic, the condition of the prison where Epstein was, then financial fraud, then some stories about England. The documents are arranged extremely chaotically. There's tons of purely clerical correspondence here. Someone asks someone to call, schedules meetings, requests this or that document. This, by the way, looks especially idiotic because the names of the participants are covered with squares, and all you learn is that someone called someone or someone met with someone. There are also quite a few crazy anonymous messages to the investigation, where people write that all of Epstein's secrets are hidden behind the second painting on the left, or that there's a maniac prowling the dark net, hunting Epstein's victims. Now on the internet, people tend to complain that there are a lot of black squares in the Epstein case. Fans are dissatisfied that they didn't get their content delivered. But for me, the biggest problem seems to be that, besides this main topic, the adventures of American high school girls in mansions with princes and billionaires, several supposedly very important topics have surfaced. Possibly even more important than the initial one, but nobody's tackling them. If you're interested in looking more closely at theories about politicians related to this case, like Trump for example, write in the comments so I know what video to make next.